The hum of JFK's Terminal 4 was a steady drone. Rolling luggage, murmured announcements, the distant clatter of carts. It was white noise to most, but not to Max. Max's ears twitched first. Then came the growl. Low, vibrating with a strange tension, as the German Shepherd stiffened beside Detective James Walker. Before James could react, Max lunged. His powerful body pulled hard on the leash. Jaws bared, muscles coiled with purpose. Max, heel! James barked, instinct taking over. But the dog didn't listen. Max surged toward the carousel, eyes locked on a single unremarkable black suitcase inching its way along the conveyor. In 4 years of service, Max had never broken protocol. Not once. He'd sniffed out bodies buried in riverbanks, tracked the scent of fear in alleyways, and located evidence no one else could find. He was precise, controlled, always in sync with James. Until now, the commotion rippled fast. Travelers scattered, an instinctive alarm. Some pulled children close. Others filmed with raised phones. Security moved in, hands hovering over tasers, confusion turning quickly into tension. But James raised a hand. "Hold your positions," he said, voice sharp. "This isn't aggression. This is a find." Max had stopped barking now. He sat rigid, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowed, tail flicking. A hunter poised on the edge of something unseen. James approached the suitcase slowly, fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. His gut tightened. Not the usual tightening before a bust, but something else. A deeper kind of knowing. The kind that reminded him of the last time he felt truly powerless. Standing over his sister's empty bed the night she disappeared. He crouched beside Max. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured. The dog whined low in his throat. It wasn't fear. It was grief. A sound James had only heard once, when Max had sniffed out the remains of a 6-year-old girl buried in the woods of Long Island. That same tone, that same trembling. James waved to the TSA officers. "We need a secure inspection. Now." The suitcase was moved to a cleared area. The X-ray monitor lit up, a mess of wiring and dense shadows. No explosives, but something odd. James opened the zipper carefully. Inside was a vintage porcelain doll, nestled in a bed of cotton. Cracked face, hollow eyes. But it wasn't the doll that made the room go silent. It was what lay hidden in its chest cavity, surgically hollowed out and filled. A severed human hand. Female. Pale fingers curled slightly, as if in mid-reach. A thin silver bracelet clung to the wrist, dulled with tarnish, but still legible. Espy. James didn't move for a long moment. The letters were small, but they slammed into him like a punch to the ribs. He didn't know why. Not yet. A cough behind him. Someone shifting too suddenly. James turned, and locked eyes with a man in a gray suit standing at the edge of the crowd. Not close, but not far enough to be coincidence. He wasn't watching the suitcase. He was watching Max. The man's face had gone pale. His hands twitched. His body screamed flight before his brain could make the decision. "Sir, don't move!" James shouted. The man bolted. James was after him in seconds, heart pounding, Max barking at his side, the sound slicing through the sterile terminal like a warning shot. They tackled him near gate 36. The man, mid-50s, trembling, expensive watch too tight on his wrist, stammered as he hit the ground. "I didn't know," he gasped. "I didn't know what was in it. I swear." James didn't speak, just held the man's wrists behind his back, feeling the bones shake beneath the skin. And for a moment, just a moment, he wasn't in JFK. He was in a dark hallway 16 years earlier, staring at the door that never opened again. Caroline's door. His sister. The hand in the suitcase. The bracelet. Max's trembling. This wasn't random. James knew the moment he looked into the man's eyes. This was something else. Something that had just begun. The interrogation room at Terminal 4 was lit too brightly, but Robert Collins sat in a shadow of his own making. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Eyes ringed in gray, shoulders sagging forward as if they were holding something heavier than guilt. James Walker didn't speak at first. He simply slid a printed photo across the metal table. An image of the severed hand, bracelet still clinging to bone. Collins flinched. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I didn't open the suitcase. I was just supposed to deliver it." James leaned in, eyes unreadable. "To whom?" Collins swallowed hard. "A man gave it to me at the Western bus terminal. Paid me $5,000. Said it was family heirlooms. Told me not to ask questions." Max, sitting silently by the door, let out a low growl that prickled the back of James's neck. "You ever transport something like that before?" James asked. "Never." Collins paused, then whispered, "I've been having dreams since I got the case. Every night. Same girl. Long brown hair. She's reaching out, like she needs help, but I can't hear her. Her mouth moves, but there's no sound." James stilled. He didn't believe in ghosts, but Max did. He always had. Later, back at precinct headquarters, James pulled the chain around his neck and unlocked a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside was an old case file. Sarah Parker, 22. Missing since early fall. He unfolded the missing person flyer slowly, as if it might crumble in his hands. Initials SB. Last seen October 12th. Wearing silver bracelet engraved SB. The words pressed into his chest, familiar and cruel. It wasn't just the bracelet. It was her face, smiling in the photo, brown eyes bright with a hope that had since vanished. There was something in her expression that reminded him of Caroline. That same quiet fire. He picked up the phone and dialed. An hour later, he stood in front of a small home in Astoria, Queens. The lawn was immaculate. Curtains drawn, but something about it felt paused. Margaret Parker opened the door, her eyes guarded but curious. "Detective Walker," he said, "may I speak with you about your daughter?" Inside, everything was too neat. James saw it immediately. How the books on the shelves were dusted but untouched. A framed photo of Sarah in a graduation gown sat beneath a glass dome like a relic. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't flinch when James told her about the hand or the bracelet. She just sat back on the sofa and looked out the window. "I knew," she said quietly. "The day she disappeared, I felt something break inside me." James hesitated, then asked, "Did Sarah ever talk about being afraid? Anyone bothering her?" Margaret nodded slowly. "There was a man, a customer at the diner where she worked. She never gave me a name, just said he made promises and threats. She stood and disappeared into the back of the house. When she returned, she handed James a small, worn leather journal. The police took her laptop and phone. Missed this." James flipped through pages of careful handwriting, dreams, lists, work shifts. And then, a change. The tone sharpened. October 6th. DH waited outside again. Said he could make or break my future. I'm scared. I don't know who to tell. James's jaw tightened. He and Max visited Sarah's last known address, an old dorm-style building in East Harlem, now converted to private rentals. The hallway smelled of mildew and disinfectant. The landlady, a tired woman in her 60s, unlocked the room. She was quiet, polite. "Didn't stay long," she said. "But people always leave that room." "Why?" She hesitated. "They say it's haunted." The room was bare now. A twin bed, a desk, a dresser missing a handle. But something clung to the space. Something cold. Max entered cautiously, his body low to the ground. James scanned the room, his instincts rising. Then he saw them. 10 long gouges carved into the wall beside the bed. Fingernail marks. He crouched, tracing the scratches. They were desperate. Human. Max let out a soft, uneasy whine and backed toward the door. The landlady's voice dropped to a whisper. The girl who lived here after Sarah left in the middle of the night. Said someone was sitting on her chest, watching her sleep. James stared at the wall, feeling the chill settle in his spine. "What do you think happened to Sarah?" he asked quietly. The landlady crossed herself. "I think she never left that night." James couldn't sleep. He sat in his kitchen, Max curled at his feet, the journal opened before him. He reread the entry. "DH make or break. I'm scared." He looked over at Max, who watched him with those deep, knowing eyes. The dog hadn't relaxed since they left that room. "Something's not right," James whispered. "This isn't just a missing persons case. It's something else." Max raised his head and stared at the door, like he was waiting for someone. Or something. The autumn wind rolled through the city like a quiet warning, pulling yellowed leaves across the concrete as James sat in his car outside the city morgue. His coffee had gone cold. Max, restless in the back seat, let out a low sigh and placed his chin on the seat's edge, watching his handler with eyes that seemed to understand too much. Inside, the fluorescence buzzed faintly as Dr. Emily Bennett pulled on her gloves. "It was no accident," she said without turning around. "The cut, clean, deliberate. No hesitation. No frenzy." James leaned in. On the stainless steel table lay the severed hand, drained, pale, and brittle. The skin along the wrist was sliced with surgical precision. Emily nodded toward a tray where the silver bracelet now rested, still stained with traces of dried blood. "That bracelet belonged to Sarah Parker. DNA confirms it." James didn't move, his gaze fixed on the initials SB etched so delicately, so innocently. Emily lowered her voice. "You said she went missing 3 months ago." James nodded. "Last seen getting into a truck off I-95. He pulled a folder from his coat. Sarah's case. He'd read it enough times to remember every detail. But now, new pages had begun to write themselves. Patterns were forming just beneath the surface. Michael Thompson, long-haul driver. Last person seen with Sarah. Found dead 2 months later. Truck veered off a bridge during a storm. Official cause, driver fatigue. But James had read that report too. No skid marks. No attempt to brake. Toxicology inconclusive. Now it felt like a loose thread in a very deliberate weave. He left the morgue with something sharp festering in his gut. Max stayed close, unusually alert as they made their way through the dim garage. By the time they reached the precinct, James already had a plan forming. He started with Thompson's employment records. 8 years with Harrison Transport, a massive shipping company with deep roots and shallow accountability. Their trucks moved everything from electronics to medical supplies through ports and back roads, invisible in plain sight. And Sarah? She wasn't just a waitress. She was paying her way through journalism school. Curious, observant, one entry in her journal now rang louder than the rest. Something's off with his papers. The cargo routes don't match. James dug into shipping manifests she might have seen. With help from a contact in customs, he found 2 sets of documentation for the same truck on the same day. One listed routine goods. The other, buried deep, showed sensitive biological transport. His blood chilled. That night, James called Emily. "Check your database. Look for other Jane Does. Early 20s, Caucasian, signs of precision dismemberment." She didn't ask questions. By morning, she called back. 3 in the last 18 months. 1 in Delaware, 1 in Jersey, and 1 here in Queens. All unsolved. All missing the right hand. The case wasn't just dark. It was spreading. James paced his apartment floor, the city's glow casting thin lines through the blinds. Max lay by the door, but his ears were up, alert. He hadn't rested properly in days. Neither had James. The next day, Max's nose led them where logic could not. They followed a hunch, a distribution warehouse listed as dormant in Harrison Transport's records. It sat just off the Hudson, surrounded by rusted chain link and silence. The building groaned with age. Inside, dust danced in the shafts of light cutting through boarded windows. The air was wrong, stale, heavy, as if it had memories. Max tensed immediately. His body stiffened, hackles raised. James followed him past empty crates, rusted shelving, until Max stopped at a steel door hidden behind stacked pallets. It wasn't locked. The door creaked open to reveal a soundproof chamber, floor padded, walls insulated. In the corner, a table. On it, a collection of personal items arranged with ritualistic precision. Earrings, a wallet, a phone with a cracked screen. And there, atop the stack, a nursing school application. Sarah Parker. Half completed. James froze. Max sniffed the air, whimpered softly, then turned to the far wall, pawing at a recessed panel. Behind it, shelves lined with Ziploc bags, each containing something different. Lipsticks, hair ties, photographs, trophies. James's heart pounded in his ears. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a shrine, a ledger of vanished lives. He backed out, dialing Emily. "We found something," he said. "It's not just Sarah. It's all of them." As crime scene techs arrived, the tension in James's chest didn't ease. It sharpened. This wasn't the end of the mystery. It was only the door. And someone had gone to great lengths to keep that door sealed. That night, James stood over his board of victims. Timelines, names, connected by red string like nerves across a body long gone cold. He stared at a name scrawled in Sarah's journal. D.H. Daniel Harrison. A face once known only from business magazines now loomed large in the shadows. Philanthropist. Shipping magnate. Invisible hand. James looked at Max. "We're not chasing ghosts anymore," he said quietly. "We're chasing a man." And somewhere in the silence, Max let out a low, breathless growl, as if he already knew where this road would lead. The wind howled against the windows of the safe house perched on the outskirts of the Catskills, where the FBI had tracked Daniel Harrison through a trail of burner phones and hastily wiped bank records. But it wasn't the wind that kept James Walker on edge. It was the stillness inside. The air was thick with unspoken tension as the tactical team fanned out. Max stayed pressed to James's side, his posture stiff, breath shallow. Then came the crackle over comms. Target located. Preparing to breach. 3 seconds later, the door burst inward with a sharp thud. The scream of boots on hardwood. Voices shouting. A shuffle. And then, clear. James stepped inside last. The man sitting in the leather chair near the fireplace didn't look like a predator. He looked like an executive on a business retreat. Unshaven, yes, but composed. A glass of bourbon rested untouched by his knee. "You took your time," Harrison said, his voice raspy but steady. "I expected the knock days ago." James stared at him. "You expected to get caught?" "I expected someone to care enough to try." That night, in the interrogation room, the carefully constructed mask began to slip. Harrison leaned forward, hands clasped, the gleam of expensive cufflinks dulled by sweat and time. "I didn't kill her," he said, "but I knew. I knew what was happening, and I looked the other way." James said nothing. Harrison continued. "The trucks, the containers, they were mine, but I was just a link. The orders, they came from higher up. You ever heard of Senator William Blackwood?" James froze. The name had floated through the shadows of other investigations like a ghost. Untouchable, omnipresent, above consequence. Blackwood wasn't just a lawmaker. He was an architect of silence, a gatekeeper. Harrison's hands trembled as he spoke. They used my business to move them. Girls, women, sometimes worse. I kept quiet, paid well for it. But when Sarah started poking around, she saw too much. She took photos, asked the wrong questions. She was smart, but not careful. James reached into his folder and slid a photograph across the table. Sarah's face, bruised, defiant, taken from the hidden footage recovered in the warehouse. Harrison couldn't meet her eyes. She filmed that before she vanished, James said. A message. She knew they were coming. I begged them to let her go, Harrison said quietly. But Blackwood had already made the call. Later that night, in a sealed server room at FBI headquarters, agents decrypted Harrison's hard drives. What they found wasn't just records. It was horror. Videos, emails, a list of names. Not just traffickers and handlers, but politicians, judges, and executives. People whose careers had been built on secrets and who now faced ruin. In one folder, marked simply Last Resort, they found a recording of Sarah Parker. The camera was unsteady. She sat on the floor of a small room, face drawn but eyes blazing. If you're watching this, she whispered, I'm probably dead. James turned away from the screen. Max nudged his hand. The next day, news of Harrison's arrest leaked. Before the FBI could act on the rest of the evidence, someone had tipped off Blackwood. That night, as James walked Max near his apartment, the sound of screeching tires shattered the quiet. A black SUV hurtled toward them from the shadows. James had just enough time to shout before it struck. Pain exploded across his ribs as he hit the ground. Max lunged, then yelped in agony as a silenced shot tore into his side. Gunfire erupted. James fired blind, hitting taillights as the SUV vanished into the night. The world tilted. Blood pooled beneath Max's shaking body. James clutched the dog to his chest, whispering, Stay with me, buddy. Don't you leave me. At the hospital, as Max was wheeled into emergency surgery, James's badge and weapon were taken from him. Suspended pending internal review, said Captain Monroe, eyes grim. There are allegations you broke protocol, tampered with evidence. They're protecting Blackwood, James said. Monroe didn't disagree. He just looked tired. That night, James sat alone outside the veterinary ICU. His hands were still shaking. Inside the glass, Max lay motionless, hooked to wires, fighting for his life. James whispered, We're not done. Not yet. The room smelled of antiseptic and quiet grief. Max lay still beneath a white blanket, bandaged from neck to flank, his chest rising with the slow rhythm of machines. James sat nearby, eyes hollow from 3 sleepless nights. The vet's words echoed like a drumbeat in his skull. He made it through surgery, but we won't know about mobility until the swelling goes down. James hadn't left. He read the same case notes over and over, fingers tracing Sarah's handwriting from her recovered journal, as if the loops of her letters might give him answers. Then came a knock at the glass. Dr. Emily Bennett stood there, holding a manila envelope, eyes tired but sharp. You need to see this. In the dim light of the back office, she slid out photographs, scanned pages from a client file Thomas Walker had secretly turned over. James stared. Senator Blackwood. Offshore accounts. A hidden server. One email, time-stamped 6 days before Sarah's disappearance, chilled him to the bone. She knows. Eliminate her quietly. Burn the trail. Thomas's handwritten note accompanied the pages. I can't watch from the sidelines anymore. Do what I never could, James. Finish this. It was enough to force the FBI to reopen the case. Enough to nullify James's suspension. Enough to act. By week's end, a federal task force had been assembled. Blackwood's properties were raided. At a lakeside estate in Virginia, They found a server farm buried beneath a guest house, protected by biometric locks. Inside, video archives, travel logs, records of cash transfers. And names. So many names. The walls James had slammed into for years began to crack. But it was Sarah's video, the one recovered from the encrypted folder, that haunted them all. In it, she sat against a brick wall, her voice quiet but firm. I saw the shipping manifest. The numbers didn't match. I think they're moving more than just cargo. I have the photos. I sent copies to my professor. If anything happens to me, please don't let it disappear with me. Margaret Parker watched the footage in silence, her fingers curled around her daughter's bracelet. When the screen went black, she whispered. She knew what it would cost. James nodded. And she gave it anyway. At the precinct, Max returned. Limping, tail wagging slightly, a scar etched along his rib cage. The unit clapped. James knelt and clipped his badge onto Max's collar again. The sound was as satisfying as any gavel. You ready? He whispered. Max huffed softly, nudging his hand. The press called it the Sarah Parker tapes, the biggest trafficking takedown in a decade. 63 arrests, 12 countries. One senator resigned under a swarm of indictments. James didn't attend the press conference. Instead, he stood in the rain beside Margaret, watching as Sarah's memorial was unveiled near the station. A bronze plaque beneath a young birch tree. It read, "For the ones who spoke when no one listened." As Max lay beside the stone, James said, "She didn't just spark the case. She saved lives." Margaret looked at him. "And so did you." A week later, Robert Parker visited the precinct. He'd used his savings, what he hadn't drunk away, to start the SPF, the Sarah Parker Foundation. Legal aid for victims. Housing. Anonymous tip lines. James didn't speak. He just nodded and gripped the man's hand. The guilt in Robert's eyes hadn't faded. But now it had purpose. The next morning, a dispatch came through. Missing girl, age 16. Last seen near the subway station. James grabbed his jacket. Max stood ready. As they reached the door, Captain Monroe called out, "You sure you're up for this?" James paused, then smiled. "For the one still out there?" "Always." The wind tugged at his coat as they stepped outside. Max's nose lifted, catching a scent James couldn't yet understand. But he didn't need to. He followed the dog. And together, they disappeared into the morning haze, where the echoes of the past still whispered, and the ones they'd lost kept guiding them forward. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.